Welcome to Equilibrium. This is Pietro Paganini. And the question today is, sugar really the enemy, or are we falling for yet another food myth? Welcome to Equilibrium, the podcast that helps you build a balanced diet with science-based facts so you can live healthier and longer. We add sugar to everything. We fear it like poison, but how much do we really know about it? In this episode, we cut through the noise and bring the science. Joining us is Professor Roberta Re, one of Europe's leading nutrition expert, here to answer clearly and honestly the questions everyone's asking. Is sugar bad for you? Can it be addictive? How much sugar is too much? Is honey healthier than white sugar? And are sweeteners good alternatives to sugar? Got question about sugar? Roberta Re has the answers. Clear, straightforward, and practical. So tune in and learn how to live with sugar without falling for the myths. Now, Roberta Re is really the great expert since she's the director of the World Sugar Research Organization. Roberta has a PhD in biochemistry from the King's College London and has over 20 years of experience working at the interface of academia, industry, and government. And Roberta is currently director at Cambridge Food Science and the food and drink specialist for the UK government Department of Business and Trade. So, Roberta, welcome here. I'm so honored and delighted. And the question I have for you is the question everybody has it right now. Is sugar really poison? And what does science say about sugar? And we really need to know what science says about sugar.
Thank you so much, Pietro, and very good question, possibly one of my favorite. The answer is very simple, is no. Sugar is not a poison. First, by definition, a poison is something that is harmful at any dose, and that's not the case for sugar. Sugar, it's something that our body needs and use on a regular basis for the most basic function, the movement of our muscle and the function of our brain. So, absolutely not. The body is actually very clever and will always metabolize the nutrients that we take and breaks them down into smaller molecules and get down into the glucose because it's a readily available energy that it needs for a lot of function. So no, it's not a poison. And as I often say, there are occasions where, if you're unwell and you rush to hospital, this is what you get given, in those little drops. You get given sugar and salt, really. The electrolytes and the glucose are two things that really our body needs for many function. Where is this whole problem coming from? Again, it's not our body, it's us. It's what we do with it, how much and how often we consume certain things. So, it's always the answer. The answer is depends on the amount and also the context. It's not the same for everyone.
Yes,
So
exactly. You talk about the amount. So one of the questions could be, what is the right amount of sugar per day? Because at the end, it's all about portions and frequency, isn't it?
exactly, and that is where is the difficult part, and this is where I often find myself in conversation. There is the science, there is the regulatory body that's trying to give consumer guidelines, and those guidelines are the same for children, young adults, elderly people, those who run marathon, those like me who and you must probably sit at our desk most of our days, and so it's very, very difficult. How do you make these recommendations based on very specific science work and very generic? So what does that public health says is limit your consumption within a certain amount, and the way these things are calculated are quite complex, and it's not, science is never, in many things, this black and white. We do it like we do risk assessment, and actually we have had in Europe a risk assessment for sugar, and they couldn't really come up with an answer because, as I said to you, it really depends. It depends what you need. It depends on your daily need. As I said, if you run a marathon, it's very different than, a resting day at the beach where you might really need a cold sugary drink, but for different reasons. So back on the guideline have a limiting suggestion of 50 grams per day. What does that even mean? It means that
Average. So that's for the average citizen.
yeah, so based on the assumption that we all need 2,000 calories a day, they say, well, try to limit your simple sugar so it's not all the carbohydrate because sugar is a simple carbohydrate, to limit it to about 10%. That basically it all translates down into these 50 grams. There is 10, 12 teaspoons of sugar. There is about 200 calories if you look at a 10% over 2000 calories. So it's not a lot. But where it gets really complex is the fact that we're talking about what sugar are we talking? What
Indeed.
sugars?
That's what I want to hear because you said 50 grams of sugar. The question is, where do we get 50 grams of sugar? Is from marmalade, jam, candies, pasta.
Absolutely.
It's from
Yeah,
pasta, isn't it?
absolutely. I mean, we in these guidelines we talk about what is defined in regulation as free or added sugar, depending on which part of the world you're in. And when we consumer talk about sugar, we always think about the white granules that we have
We
at
put
the
in
table,
coffee.
so the sucrose that that's the one that we generally talk about. But of course, there's sugar in every fruits and veg that we consume. Obviously, the sweeter the fruit, the more the sugar and the tastier, and that is not generally included in these guidelines. The guidelines talk about try to avoid excess sugar consumption for products that are very high in what is defined as an added sugar. But again, it's very difficult to measure it. It's my birthday, I'm having cake. No, I'm not really going to count down on that. Is Easter, there are occasions in which our sugar consumption is definitely hitting that mark extremely easily for everyone. I think where we have to look at guidelines is really this benchmark on frequency of consumption. It really can give us an idea. Okay, so how often, how frequently, and that's
Yeah,
really
but now you have an excellent British English, I would say, but you're originally from the region of Canal, from Sicily. Okay, so you say you're not gonna get a cake at your birthday, but you're probably gonna get a canal or several
absolutely.
canal. So as a consumer, now we hear everywhere sugar is everywhere. Sugar is in the beverages. Very dangerous. Sugar is in fruit, and people say, well, but in vegetable or in fruit, the sugar is different. So what is the difference between added artificial sugar, natural sugar, the glucose or fructose, lactose? These are all sugar. And what about even the one in the carbohydrates? Since we talk about pasta,
Yes,
where I want to go with
absolutely. Never forget the pasta, 100%. I mean, as you say, I'm a Southern Italian. I mean, we only know carbohydrates in every form. Our main food group of pasta, pizza, and ice cream. So, but it's a very, very good point. And there's been a lot. We've done it with a lot of micronutrients, the good and the bad fat. And now we're talking about the good and the bad sugar. A molecule is a molecule. A molecule of sucrose is a glucose and a fructose together. It's a sugar. It is a simple sugar, and it really, as a molecule, is exactly the same if you have it, in your teaspoon, or if it's coming from fruit, or if it's coming from coconut versus beetroot. It's sugar. That's really the same molecule. What is very different is the context in which it comes from. And so, obviously, if I am consuming a large volume of sugar on its own, that generally might come from a beverage, or, there are not many sources of sugar on its own. Generally, it's happily coming with fats or other carbohydrates or nutrients. It's very, very different that if I'm having some fruit, I'm having vegetable, I'm having it part of the diet. And this is where really the messages should be very important. We're focusing too much on isolated ingredient, isolated nutrients, and vilifying these individual compounds, where the per se they are not really the danger. And is often this is where the misconception come from. Sugar is not dangerous, but if we are over consuming anything, that is where the problem is. And sometimes we can overconsume more easily certain form of food versus other. No, many of us overconsume, broccoli and
Yeah,
and green.
this is the fun part though, because when I look at the pyramid, the Mediterranean pyramid, you have fruit with sugar at the bottom of the pyramid, and we should eat a lot every day, big portions, with high frequency. And then on top of it, you have dessert, okay,
Yeah.
cakes and cannoli. But there, in that case, sugar is less, encouraged or suggested. What's the difference between the two?
I mean, of course. I mean, fruits and veg also contain a lot of other nutrients, vitamin, mineral, fiber. Fiber is something that we have so forgotten to talk about. And actually, when you look at a lot of the science and the dietary recommendation that come and look at population consumption, what they actually say is that we see an incidence of health, a higher rate of health, that by which we mean a reduced incidence of disease. It's very difficult to say healthy without considering the onset of any form of disease. Where we find that is where there is a higher consumption of fruit and veg. We don't actually find that there are more disease where there is a higher consumption of whatever process or whatever high density food we want to classify them as. So really, where the evidence is that our health will come from the consumption of the good stuff, and that's what we really should be focusing on. And to your point about the sugar, fruits and vegetables are rich in sugar, but they're also rich of a lot of other things, including fiber. The other problem is the calories. When you're consuming foods that are very energy dense, they're quite palatable and they're quite easy to overconsume. And we don't really realize how much energy goes in this very small portion. We often now all very much see the comparison of certain fruit versus a cake. It's fairly obvious, but while you're eating, you often underestimate. And so this is where we get our excess consumption of energy. So absolutely.
So you are saying that, for instance, when we get drinks and that are rich in sugar, that's something that we should moderate more, obviously, than the fruit. You know,
This is Yeah, and this is another very interesting point because the difference the calories have when we consumed our perception of energy intake when we consume something liquid versus the solid is
yeah.
very interesting. We would happily stop and have a cappuccino with 200 calories between the sugars, the cream, and whatever else that goes in it, and then go home and eat dinner. But if you stop and eat a sandwich with 200, 250 calories, you will get home and think like, I'm not that hungry because I had a sandwich. Our perception of how we intake calorie is incredible. There's a lot of research looking at the fact how our brain doesn't count the liquid calories in the same way. And this is from learning experience, the chewing, the time that it
Mhm.
takes, and the way we perceive it is very, very different. So there is a lot to be said about our eating habits, our eating behavior, rather than the poor food per se.
One of the questions that obviously is intriguing, and I hear and read a lot, is that apparently the industry and companies, food companies, beverage companies, would add a lot of sugar because of what you just said. That is, in a way, is good for our, is palatable and it's good for us, and we go back to it. So the question is sugar addictive? Are we addicted to sugar like we're probably addicted to, I say something very bad and big now, and whoever is watching us will like, wow, it's like nicotine? Is like, are we getting that's a big one.
So there is not a clinical definition of sugar addiction. There's actually been research going into that, and the scientific consensus is that no, you do not have a physiological addiction to sugar like you would have to other substances. There is a very known mechanism by which the body responds to a certain molecule with neurotransmitter and so on. So those addictions are very well measured. Now, what happened with sugar is actually a very interesting branch of science. There is the evolutionary science that I really find interesting and fascinating and linked to the behavioral science that I work in. Because obviously, if you look back, our evolutionary time, we didn't have the knowledge that we now have. I don't know how often it can be more harmful than good, but you go in the wild and you don't know if that tomato versus that other, thing is healthy or not. So you don't know, is it going to kill me? At the origin of our eating, we had no label to tell us, what the shelf life of something was. So we had to rely on our senses to establish if something was safe. So our sensory tasting was one of the first part. And that tasting, and even young children have that. Something sweet is automatically recognized as good. Breast milk is sweet. So we associate that with something safe. Something sour or something bitter, suggests something there is a spoilage. Obviously, we have to learn all of that through experience. Sometimes we survive that experience and we learned. But also, so anything that is sweet, and the way it works also on plants, how do you know that an apple is ripe and is ready to eat or not? So it's your sensory response. Now we do know, but originally we were just so, what should it taste of? And with time, our body learned that when an apple is sweet and softer, it was better. All the nutrients, the antioxidants, and everything was more digestible because you can break it down. Anything too lignant fiber is great, but there is a point over which we can't really digest. So with time, we have developed this learning system. And what the sugar does is they also trigger that part of the brain where the dopamine kicks in. There is a part of our reward system. And that was a very important evolutionary thing, because don't forget, in those times, going out to hunt and gather had its own risks. So actually, we needed a drive that was our appetite and our dopamine craving to get out and take the risk to be eaten by something else that found us tasty and nutritious.
So our ancestors, for them, were going out, running all day, running after animals, picking the small fruits they had, and then finally got something sweet to eat, and their dopamine was today
And that
we need a video
would be
game
the
for that
trigger.
dopamine, huh?
Yeah, but that would trigger us to take the risk and go out again and do it again. But also, the risk was reduced if something was more energy dense. Because again, from a survival point of view, if I can, take the same amount of effort to get something more energy dense and more nutritious, is an evolutionary advantage.
Yeah,
Obviously, fast forward to our days, and we don't really have those same needs, but we're still hardwired to have the
yeah,
same reward system. That is not an addiction, that is a natural reward. And of course, palatability is a thing that we still highly appreciate and reward. Who doesn't want something that
yes.
tastes good? So I don't think it's a deliberate intention to harm, but it's certainly, if a product doesn't taste good, we're not going to buy it. We're not
Yeah,
going to eat it.
you're right. It's part of our gene or the way we are designed, and we were designed to survive. Otherwise, we were not here. And it's also very interesting the fact that the sweets were part of were gifts to the gods during the ancient Greek
Yeah.
time, to the Roman time, the Egyptian, when artificial sugar was not there. So it was so important as a form of rewarding, as a form, as you said,
Yeah.
for acknowledgement and in a way dopamine as well. But today we go into something different. Today there is a problem of abundance, as you mentioned, with the junk food or fast food, where it's there and there's many of them. So it's probably more of a food deserts. But let me ask you, because otherwise we run out of time. But I would continue, and I need to call you back here talking about fibers now. So you talk about fibers now. Everybody wants to know everything about fibers, but how much
Mm.
sugar involved in obesity? Because we see a lot of kids, particularly even in Sicily and in the south of Italy or around Europe, not just in the US, and also in developing countries. And one of the reason is, according to the World Health Organization and many other, scientific organization, is we need to reduce sugar. Do you think that is the solution, and that's the criminal nutrient that we should start taking away from our diet? Because I heard people recently saying, I'm eating no sugar, particularly in the US, where they are very extreme and sometimes ideological. No sugar, I'm going to get sugar from proteins. And I was like, but your brain needs glucose. Where are you getting? Oh, from the proteins. And I was like,
The body will do that. The body will transform the protein
in
to
sugar.
knock it down into a form of sugar, and this whole keto diets and stories
Indeed,
been around
indeed, it's
for
keto.
time. Um, I mean, your question actually triggered two very important points for me, and it's one that I would very happily discuss with you again. And it's the fact there is too much communication out there, often from experts that we're not expert in that topic. I am not an obesity expert. There are people that are
You are a
far more
biochemist, yeah?
knowledgeable than I am on this topic. I absolutely, and I often say this is because just because I understand why you eat and what you eat, it doesn't make me an expert on everything else that sits at the fringe of that. And so, obesity is a very complex um, conversation, that we oversimplify. And if you look at a lot of the data that talk about the cause of obesity, even if you look at the reason why we eat, if I ask somebody, why do you eat, you know hunger is realistically ever the case in the Western world. We eat for so many reasons: because it's lunchtime, because somebody else is eating, because I'm in a good mood, in a bad mood. Honestly, when was the last time that we were really starving and needed food? We could go a few days, we'll be fine. Um, and we override our satiety and all sorts of things. So there is, starting from that is complex, and then you look at all the phenomenon there is on the weight gain and the metabolism and so on. So there is so much into that. To simplify into one single ingredient is very simplistic. Even to simplify into the food, that with no doubt is the vector, is where your calories come from. So it's a very simplistic story to say, well, I gain weight because of the food. Yes, you do, but also doesn't explain the obesity pandemic that we have. But going to your point about the sugar, recent data has actually been looking at all the countries that have had policy implemented to try and reduce sugar consumption. And although sugar consumption, with all the pitfall of what that exactly means, has gone down, obesity rates are still going up. And so we have constantly this debate between, oh, but it's because we're not doing enough, or it's because we should do more. And actually, it is questionable if some of these policies are really delivering on what they're hoping to do. And again,
And I
it's
guess
down
you're
to
talking
individual.
specifically about taxation as well, or incentives to reformulate products by taking away or reducing the quantity of sugar through monetary mechanism, basically.
Yeah, and in some products, you might think, okay, is it really needed? And it's actually created a lot of debate within the food production system. There are a lot of things that we often forget, and we look at sugar as a sweetener. Sugar has got loads of function, structural, weight. So I often say to people, when you try and take sugar out of a cake or a biscuit, if you want 100 grams of that product, you still got to have 100 grams of something that, unless it's at 0 calorie, you're still going to have calories. And it's still a cake that doesn't change when and where it should be consumed. So, yes, reformulation can help in certain space, and we have had some good example. But I think finding it as the, holy grail of solving the issue, I think is far.
Yeah, and don't you see, or don't you think that these policies, by using policies to force basically people consumption attitude, because it's in a way is reducing sugar in products and then changing our way of eating, isn't it?
Yeah, we don't have strong evidence. I mean, and this is again going back to your point. There's been some policy where you have seen a behavioral change, because at the end of the day, is that's what policy want to try and achieve, is to make either a change in the manufacturing, pushing manufacturing to change their formulation, or change a behavior in the consumer. This is where the front of pack and warning and that kind of thing is trying to achieve. I mean, if you are comparing two products and you choose based on the information that you're given, perhaps that might implement your choice. However, we know as a fact that no matter what we say, price and taste will always drive our food choice.
Yeah, yeah,
So realistically, how much does change? And to me, the big point is always, whose behavior are we trying to change? Because a normal weight, average weight person that is looking at a healthier product might have a certain impact. When we're looking at an obesity agenda and various things, I am not sure they don't cause harm, but I'm not sure they really deliver. And as you say, it's creating all this confusion. And back to your point, I've taken sugar out of my diet. Again, as a behavior is something that we often find easier to these I don't eat protein, I don't eat sugar, I don't eat carbs, I don't eat before this time. This avoidance diet tend to be a easier thing for us to follow and stick to. And I always say, again, not a dietitian, but generally the best diet is the one that you can stick to. That's the end of it. And
yeah.
if your
So
belief system sits with it, the placebo effect is
Yeah.
still the best drug we have ever had.
Yeah, yeah. So in a way, you were saying if you tax something, then also you have some, let's say, unintended consequence where maybe somebody can move to other products, paying a higher price, but then
Yeah.
you have people on a lower income that might pay more because at the end the cost is transferred most of the time to consumers that will find themselves paying more for the same product, and they are not aiming to change that product. Is that
No,
probably
and in food, we've seen is that the elasticity is such that generally the price change is not that significant on the consumption that we have. It might cause a brand shift, so I might pick now a brand that is cheaper, so it might, but really does he make a dietary change of such a significance? And we have seen cases, of these across border to go and find a product as
yeah?
original was somewhere else, depending on where you live. Obviously, in Sicily, we don't have much of that choice. But and we also
But
see
nobody wants
absolutely.
to try that, huh?
No, we don't even know what you were talking about. I mean, we're in our own planet.
But I'm fascinated. I was fascinated by this case in Norway, where Norwegians were a bit proud, but then they figure out that people were moving to Sweden, to the borders,
Yeah.
to buy cheaper products, or the same in Auckland and San Francisco, where people were really like moving somewhere else. And I also read that most of the research is based, on one vending machine. So you have people that might stop buying some drinks with high in sugar, but they are maybe moving to another vending machine and buy something else that is rich in sugar. This is very fascinating, Roberta. And our time is really running out. But it was such a great pleasure being here with you and learning so much. But one last question, because this is something that I hear a lot, and it was also written to me earlier today, and it's about sugar being replaced by sweeteners, because we were turned to use sweeteners, and then some international organization told us, well, sweeteners might be cancerogenic. So what should we do here? Everything is bad or good at the same time.
This is the thing. I mean, I always like to say to people, we live in a very safe food system. Things that get into our food system in Europe are safe. They don't enter the market with a risk. Like anything else, they can be cofactors, and it's very individual. And again, food safety, public health are based on majority of. So, you know, and it also really depends what your condition are, how much you consume. Sweetener are safe and obviously are low calorie or no calorie, really, in the level. What is really interesting about that is how much of these we're now putting into our food system, and that we don't know. I mean, there are things that only you can assess through time. Sweetener were put into the market to replace the 2 teaspoon of sugar that certainly in England we used to put in our tea, and it was cheaper and so forth. Now we're talking about alternative non-caloric sweetener. There are everywhere. Um, and again, there is this whole reformulation thing that's been happening. They're just taking the sugar out without considering what we're putting in. And sugar has so many functionals as preservative. So, I had a question the other day asked to me. It's like, well, if you're taking the sugar out from certain product, does that mean now we've got to keep them in the fridge? I was thinking, well, the shelf life might change because, it is a natural preservative. And, if you start taking sugar out and you don't add another preservative in, and that preservative in that amount in that product is safe. But if you're now eating 20 of those products every day, well, there is an upper limit for most things. Definitely the safety level are massive,
Yeah.
absolutely massive compared to what we can possibly consume. So I do not think anyone should feel worried. But I think we should all look that if you're consuming too much of anything, it can't be
You know,
right.
I had the same thing with palm oil when people were telling me, "Oh, palm oil is out," and I said, "Okay, how is it being replaced?" We don't know. And then they started digging and being worried about what replaced, for instance, palm oil. So, but luckily, our ancestor didn't have any sweetener, so they
Well,
didn't go out and
no,
fight for sugar.
They would have come across something. They would have just not. They was probably ignorance was a bliss.
Yeah.
They just leave that be.
I'm very happy that you mentioned the our ancestors, because in a way we're still built. Our body is still built
Yeah,
as we did, as we were 100,000 years ago, when little Lucy, or actually a million years ago, when they were hunting and running all day, spending a lot of burning a lot of calories, and they needed calories. And it's just in the last 70 years that we started getting calories easily, and our body is still thinking like the dogs. Is my mom dog is like always out for eating something, and I'm saying,
absolutely.
Mom, she doesn't know that tomorrow there is still food. She thinks food is gone. I need to eat now because I'm not sure tomorrow. We're still built in the same way. Yeah.
Evolutionary science is fantastic, and I always say to people, being able to store fat is an evolutionary advantage, because if you were capable to do that during a famine, you would have more chances to survive than somebody that doesn't have the same capacity or the same storage. So, it's the modern days there's change of our idea of what we should look like and what we need. But for our body, they don't know when the next famine is coming. So if I can get calories, I'll store them and I'll use them when there's no food again.
Yeah. And it's what I tell my son. We are, at least our generation, going out to the supermarket to buy sugar. Now it's
Yeah.
being delivered at home. They don't even have to walk to
I
get
know
food.
there is a
That's a big
fantastic
problem.
there is a fantastic study that was done several years ago that was looking at the impact of industrial revolution to weight gain. And there is this big thing, that they look at the diet and they say, oh, our diet changed at that time, and that's when we became, started gaining weight. But actually, if you look at it, what also happened at that time, we started to have refrigerator, washing machines, all sorts of
Yeah.
device that meant we could store food for longer, we could have more accessibility to food. So the food, don't ask teenager kids, but foods and freezer are full of foods. And then we didn't have to walk anywhere, and we had the car and all sorts of things. And they go even down and looking as, you used to use a typewriter and have to move your arms, and now you don't do that anymore. And washing machines, you're not washing your clothes by hands. And that was a huge change. They also consist with the time of the Industrial Revolution and the processing of food. But actually, and the energy balance, the energy expenditure that we lost is much
Oh,
bigger than
yeah.
the energy
And that
gain.
what we gain. That's true. We're not even
But
typing anymore.
no, we're not even typing it. We're
We're
just
just dictating to
dictating.
the
I know,
AI. It's doing everything. So we're even
I know.
losing our capacity of thinking.
I know, and
Burning
I
more
look at
sugar.
it and just think, we don't even have to get up to switch a light on anymore. It's like, that's it. We don't need to move. It's incredible. So our energy requirement has certainly gone down. But it's a point that we don't look at. And we keep on trying to go down into, but is this sugar or that
Food, yes.
sugar, is that fat or the other fat?
This is the great point. And going back to the taxes, people that are following me, I've always been very provocative to say, okay, you want to be coherent, tax sugar, tax everything, but start taxing iPhones, start taxing Netflix, start taxing video games, couches, bikes, electric bikes, because you're not really pushing, or
Uh,
anything
can
that
you,
keeps you
can
on
you,
the couch and not burning calories. So if you want to be coherent, that should be the way. Tax everything that keeps you from burning calories. But Roberta, we really have to let people go burning some calories, because we are actually causing them to accumulate a lot of calories with our talkings. So thank you very much for being here. I think we are going back to sugar, because there are a lot of questions coming in about sugar, sweeteners, and everything that is related, brown sugar, white sugar, artificial sugar. People are really interested in this. But thank you so much. We'll see, and we'll be in touch. We'll be on the social. We'll be, constantly streaming. And thank you very much to everybody for being in equilibrium, meaning living balanced, living longer and healthier. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.